Hey everyone, it's Peter again. This is going to be the first of a two-part discussion of the theme of myth and philosophy. The issue here is, as we follow the sort of historical trajectory of myth, particularly in the classical tradition, a shift is going to get made that's echoed a little bit in the contrast I was drawing between Achilles and Odysseus. In essence, a shift from a kind of often characterized as heroic age to an era that is, I guess we could use words like intellectual, analytical, reflective. Maybe those are some concepts that would go well with that. And in terms of studying mythology, one of the things we would want to keep in mind is the degree to which cultural belief or individual belief in the veracity of mythological narratives, personalities, divinities, all the rest of it, whether that individual belief is, particularly profound or meaningful anymore. And I think that this is an important concept to spend a little bit of time on, not least, of course, because of the relevance and applicability to our own time. What are the myths, what are the beliefs that contemporary human beings hold true, especially beliefs that upon closer analysis or reflection might not prove to be particularly real or convincing. And we can begin to trace the emergence of that reflexivity from a pretty early point. I've suggested to you all when I talked a little bit about Demodocus in the Odyssey that Homer, whoever or whatever Homer was, deliberately inserts the character of the bard Demodocus as a kind of indication that he's aware of what it is a poet and a singer and you could say an entertainer, all the rest of it, what that actually the person does. The next author in the sequence of these Greek composers, reciters, whatever, bards, Hesiod is much more explicit in his Theogony, the opening section of the Theogony, where he describes what the muses do. And there's a pretty well-known verse early on in the piece where he, as a poet, certainly has to rely upon the muses. And the muses, and this is kind of interesting, the muses once taught Hesiod a beautiful song while he was shepherding lambs under holy Helicon. So we have the sense, and this is a thing about Hesiod, we have a sense of who the author is and all the rest of it. And this speech, and this is given using the term mythos or mythos, the goddesses first spoke to me. They breathed a divine voice into me. So the word mythos or mythos, you sometimes flip back and forth, sort of more anglicized, more Greek pronunciation, gives us some ideas about what it is that a storyteller, a mythologist, if you will, actually does. And what's kind of interesting is that it sets into play a kind of contrast between two different sort of rhetorical realms. And Hesiod's very clearly aware of this. So what kind of speech mythos is, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, what kind of speech mythos is as opposed to something that in the Greek tradition, and it certainly has a long life afterwards right on into our own time, logos becomes an object of study and consideration and debate. So for instance, those muses point out to Hesiod, right? And this is kind of also to Hesiod's audience maybe a warning or a reminder of the complexity of speech and interpretation. We know how to say many things that aren't true but seem to be. So when we talk about speech, we talk about interpretation, the problem of veracity, truth content, if you will, versus, the falsehood that it might contain. That's certainly one approach to think about with regard to myth. Myth, of course, straddles both in the sense that we, and say 21st century mode of discourse or conversation, tend not to take, say, classical mythology literally, but our interest in the stories, the narratives, the characters remains for the most part uninterrupted, which is a pretty good record if you think Homer is, dated back to, say, the 8th or 9th century BCE. Up to the present, we're, getting on 3,000 years, and that's a pretty good track record of interest in a cultural product. So what is it that interests us still in classical myth, that where it isn't true but seems to be? So what is that quality of seeming? Okay, and that's an interesting thing to consider, because of course one of the purposes of myth in the ancient world, at least especially as later interpreters had it, was as a kind of explanation for the causes or origins of things. So the etiological aspect, etiological, the points of origins of things are explained in myth, for example. Other phenomena in the world explained through the operations of divine beings and so forth. So does that begin to change? And historically, we actually find that it does. So that's, where the plot thickens, so to speak. And to do that, we need to think about the emergence of Greek philosophy. So what do I mean about what am I talking about when I talk about Greek philosophy? So in essence, what we want to do when we consider the emergence of philosophy, which is a historical phenomenon, we can date it in terms of chronology, and we can locate it in terms of geography, and we can assign specific individuals, roles in this process. And so this slide contains a number of those individuals, and we'll talk about them briefly and what they did. One of the things to think about with the emergence of Greek philosophy is, of course, what is it that philosophy does? In the Greek tradition, what it primarily did was try to explain the world. This took two primary directions, and we'll talk about the earlier one first, and then explore the later one, probably in a separate presentation. The first direction is that of naturalist philosophers, and I think that's the name gives a sense of the interests of the naturalist philosophers. In essence, they're trying to figure out what the world around them is made of, what can explain the appearances and processes of nature. The second one, which we'll talk about more detail in the second presentation, are the humanist philosophers. The naturalist philosophers are often described as the pre-Socratics, the philosophers who come along before Socrates. And Socrates is often credited with a more humanist approach, and that's why we'll talk about him later. So the pre-Socratics are looking at the world around them and trying to find out or find explanations for how things work. So some steps that kind of come along with that are given in a handy numbered list right here. One of them is to demythicize, basically remove divine causes as agency in nature. So Zeus doesn't make thunderstorms, that kind of thing. Logical processes for determining the causes of things versus simple faith, assertion of belief, this type of thing. You need to be able to, in a sense, show your work here, and this is going to apply to the next four, I think, items as well. So a practical and analytical approach. Analysis means literally to break things down into their constituent pieces. So pre-Socratics are starting to look at the world and say, well, what are the phenomena that make up the phenomena? And what are the processes, and how can we, make them, in essence, hang together, make them work? Part of that process of analysis and potential practical application, of course, is the use of observation. So that empirical approach, EMPIRICAL, is critical. And in terms of actually recording, which is going to be another aspect, it's probably going to be important to measure whatever these phenomena are. And it's not coincidence that this is the time that we start seeing the emergence of geometry and, of course, the proofs and arguments going along with geometry. So this is a major step in thinking about the world, and it's necessarily going to require, if followed logically, the removal, the dethroning of mythology as a legitimate kind of mode of explaining the world. Some individuals that are worth kind of remembering in this regard are listed above. Thales is one of the earliest pre-Socratics, so we can put him in the 7th into the 6th centuries. And by the way, a number of these individuals were focused geographically in an area known as Ionia, which is basically the sort of far east coast of the Mediterranean, what today is Turkey. So it seems to be a kind of cluster of individuals centered geographically there. Anyway, Thales is going to argue, and it's not a bad argument if you think about the underlying nature of all things being water, the multiple possible states of water might naturally lean us to think that, maybe everything is either solid water or liquid water or vapor. And it's, depending on how you want to define water and the rest of it, it's not a bad beginning, and it certainly removes that issue of divine agency driving everything. Heraclitus has a particularly strong and interesting argument thinking about what the world is made of ultimately is change. We perceive change in terms of all kinds of things transforming, shifting, changing in terms of their form, appearance, movement. We see this all the time, but Heraclitus also is going to argue that there's something called logos. And this is, again, coming back to our mythos and logos aspect, a kind of ordering principle in the world that guides all of this change. So in essence, the underlying reality of the world is not seen in terms of substance, but in terms of, basically you could argue, reason, a rational principle or guide to which all flux ultimately subscribes. If we look at the work of Leucippus and Democritus, we only really understand these people in terms of very fragmentary, specific utterances on their part or references by other philosophers. We'll see with Leucippus and Democritus the idea that reality is made up of small indivisible particles. That's literally what the word atom means. And that to understand reality, we need to think of it in terms of these particles moving through space and time. That we, for instance, as human beings, are in essence just groups of atoms put together, and Heraclitus might step in and say, according to a logos, and coming together and falling apart, again, without that aspect of divine agency. The last one in the list is, in some ways, kind of an even greater degree of abstraction from the logos that Heraclitus has. Pythagoras talks in terms of the ultimate reality being founded in number and proportion, that, again, we just mentioned about nature being measurable. The nature can indeed be analyzed and understood in terms of number and relations of numbers to one another, that's the ultimate nature of true reality. And it's a pretty convincing argument, especially in a digital era where it seems like everything can indeed be reduced to numbers. The word, sort of mythology, as it were, of Pythagoras, and a lot of interesting things about Pythagoras, is that irrational numbers gave him a great deal of intellectual difficulty, in particular pi, the ratio between diameter and circumference of a circle. So yeah, there we are for now. And in the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit more about myth and humanist philosophers, but this is a good place to start for thinking